Nash and I turned around to allow the human to get dressed in privacy. Nash was on edge the entire time that our backs were turned. He must still think the little critter could be a threat. He's not wrong, I suppose. Not the kind of threat that would attack you without a weapon, though. The kind that could outthink and outmaneuver you on a battlefield? Maybe. This human had just awoken and had already demonstrated knowledge of fringe intellectual pursuits like evolution and nutrition. It spoke of things I had spent extensive effort to learn as if they were common knowledge. My younger brother had stumbled onto a goldmine of knowledge. Even if the human didn't have any more knowledge than what he had already displayed, just studying his anatomy would be revolutionary. He would likely be opposed to vivisection, though, even with healing magic available. "I'm ready, I think," Nick said. My brother and I turned around to look at the human. He actually cut a dashing figure, if you're into that sort of thing. Trimmed black hair that was longer on the top than on the sides, dark blue eyes with a hint of green, a chiseled jawline, and musculature that was reminiscent of a fighter. He had a scar to the right of his chin that was barely noticeable, and a much more noticeable scar on his left temple. He could pass as a short elf or a tall dwarf, were it not for the ugly round ears. Nash was right. They're very jarring now that I look closer. "All right, let's go," Nash replied. We exited the room with the human to my left and Nash to the human's left. The girls were peeking around the corner of the hallway, curious of the human's activities. Yini and Nemora were enamored with the thing, but Catalina seemed afraid of it. I will have to remember to ask her about her reasons for that. Perhaps it's merely a phobia, but she might be able to detect something that I can't about the human. I had no reason to believe the same of Nash, though. My brother was infamously overreactive and overprotective. His near hostility towards the human makes little sense, since he's the one that brought it from the dungeon. I glanced at the human as we walked. It walked very similar to Nash, fully upright with a steady gait. Unlike Nash, it was keeping its eyes ahead and trying to avoid making eye contact with the orcs that quickly shuffled out of our way. As we continued on, I wondered if the human was a warrior or a mage of some sort. Not everyone has to be, of course. There are many who are neither. Most, even. But something told me that the human was special in more than its rarity. I might be setting myself up for disappointment, but I really want to see what it's capable of. I wonder what adventurer level it is. No, wait. It had shown ignorance of magic. While that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have martial combat experience, it's unlikely to be above level 2 if it's never heard of magic. Perhaps instructing it on magic would boost its level. Listen, Nick. When we get to the chief's chamber, you need to be quiet unless you're directly asked a question. You're technically an outsider, and you're deeper in our village than an outsider is allowed to be. An outsider meeting the chief in the chamber is unheard of, so if you're rude, there's bound to be bad consequences, warned Nash. I understand. I'll keep quiet, replied Nick. Oh, I don't think it'll be all that dire, I said. After all, Nash is the reason you're here. If you do anything naughty, he's liable to take the blame. I returned Nash's glare with a malicious grin, a not-so-subtle reminder that all this is his fault. But I'll likely have to remind him that whatever the fate of his team is, he's not to blame for that. They went off on their own volition, and he wasn't even their leader. He was their strongest, but Graz was the leader. And Graz decided to leave their strongest behind and continue on, and the others followed him. If Graz survived, I'm going to give him a good skull-shaking for his stupidity. We entered the chamber and my blood ran cold. Alern and Rirnu stood before the chief, looking ashamed. I didn't waste time wondering where Pakin and Kirasaka were. These two wouldn't be here alone if things had gone well. A boss had been encountered. Nash, I'm sorry, said Gluhern. Your party didn't make it. Nash's jaw tightened as the realization hit home. He looked at Alern and Rirnu, and both of them avoided his eyes. He swallowed and nodded at the chief. I reached over and patted his elbow to comfort him. He'd need a drink tonight. Chief, I began, I take it that Kirasaka and Pakin didn't make it either? Correct. Was it a boss? We believe so. What are we going to do about it? That's what we're deciding, Gluhern said and pointed to the human. I wanted to speak to that to find out more information. Care to introduce us? "Allow me," said Nash. We all looked at my brother, not expecting him to be able to speak yet. Perhaps I didn't give him enough credit, and he already knew that what happened wasn't his fault. Nash is a great brother. He's full of surprises, never boring. "This is Nicodemus Liam Smith, a human who may have been transported to our world from another world. He goes by Nick," Nash said, gently pushing the human forward. "Pleased to make your acquaintance," Nick said, bowing at the waist. Everyone froze for a second. Despite the grim attitude of the meeting, there were a few chuckles. "I am not a king, I am a chief. You need not genuflect to me," Gluhern said with a chuckle. "Need not genuflect? A remarkable increase in vocabulary," I said while jerking my head to the left to dodge a thrown goblet. "Don't patronize me, sorcerer!" Gluhern yelled. The metal goblet clattered behind me. I grinned. Most of the drinking utensils in the village were either made of wood, glass, or ceramic. The chief had tired of having to order replacement cups and had changed all of his utensils to metal. This was much more economical, considering that this type of spat of ours is nearly traditional at this point. I frequently critiqued Gluhern for several reasons. The first and foremost reason was that I got amusement from his reactions. The second reason was to remind him that even though he is a chieftain, he is still an orc like the rest of us. It's all too easy to forget a simple fact like that when your word is law. The third reason is to keep my reaction time healthy. I stole a glance at the two surviving members of the rescue party and immediately regretted my shenanigans. Alern, who was normally mountainous, was now staring into the distance as if lost in thought and looking significantly deflated. Rirnu was struggling not to cry. Gluhern and I met each other's eyes, and I could tell we both felt shame at our outbursts. "I'm sorry," Gluhern said to everyone except me. "Nick, I called you here because you were found in the Delver's dungeon around the same area as the beast that will be the topic of discussion. Alern, please describe what happened." At the mention of his name, Alern returned to reality and began his tale. We all listened raptly, especially when he described the creature. Skin nearly as white as its hair with claws like daggers, standing like and as tall as an orc, and with speed that matched a shadow warrior's. The way it moved when it killed Pakin, almost too fast for even an over 10 to see. Very interesting, but in a very dangerous way. Something I would rather read about instead of personally study. Unless it were dead, of course. When we returned to the collapsed portion of the wall, we waited for Kirisaka to catch up, Alern said. But, after waiting for a very long time, we were teleported to the entrance. Without him. Every face listening to the story dropped except for Nick's, who looked confused instead. The human looked like he wanted to ask questions but was hesitating due to our warnings. The dungeon shifts frequently, and when it does, it teleports the adventurers still wandering around inside to the entrance, I explained softly. The only time it won't teleport someone to the entrance is if they're dead. The faces that the human made were interesting. They were alien, but so communicative that I immediately knew what they meant. His confusion turned to realization, then sadness, and then, as he turned back to look at Alern, empathy. It was at this moment that I realized that Nash was completely in the wrong about this little creature being a threat. My eyes locked with my brother's. He had seen the empathy on the human's face and knew he had been wrong. His hand dropped from the handle of his axe for the first time since we left the hospital. The only way the human could be a threat is unintentionally. Thank you, Alern, Gluhern said before turning back to Nick. Have you ever heard of this beast or anything like it? No, Chief, the human stammered, shocked by the question. No need for honorifics. Call me Gluhern, please, the chief said gently. Right, sorry. No, I haven't, Gluhern. Until I woke up yesterday, I hadn't even heard of a dungeon. In my world, monsters aren't real. Neither are orcs, elves, or dwarves. Not even magic. It's just humans and animals. I'm sorry I can't be more help, Nick said with a genuine tone. I understand. Thank you. I'll be wanting to discuss your world more in a bit, but first the topic of what to do with the creature must be addressed, Gluhern said. I don't think we have a team strong enough to beat it, Rirnu said. This was quite the revelation from the veteran healer. We had all suspected this to be the case after hearing Alern's recount, but hearing it said aloud by Rirnu seemed to set it in stone. There was nobody else in the village who knew the limits of our adventurers better. Well, we'll have to do something. We can't risk adventurer parties running into the damned thing, and closing the dungeon indefinitely will spell the death of this settlement, the chief said. What about a barrier? I asked. Block off the path that leads to the part of the dungeon with the beast in it. If we use a runic barrier and warn everybody not to mess with it, the beast won't be able to leave the part of the dungeon that it's currently in. And what's to stop it from attacking the crew sent to set up the barrier? Alern asked hollowly. It could be that pale due to living in the darkness for a long time, Nick said, which means it's probably got an aversion to light. Light is usually a bad thing in deep darkness. We all looked at the little human with various emotions on our faces. My face held curiosity, Gluhern's held amusement, Alern and Rirnu looked thoughtful, and Nash looked annoyed and angry. I almost laughed when I realized why Nash was upset. He believed the human had spoken out of turn. Yes, you may be right, Rirnu said at last. The lights leading to the room we found the beast in were all slashed and broken. We all had lights on, though, Alern said. True, but the lights in the hallway were much brighter than our lights. There were times where I nearly forgot we were underground, Rirnu said excitedly. Then his mood soured and he said, But if that's the case, then we all could have run for it, and Kirisaka didn't have to. Hindsight is helpful as long as you don't make it a hindrance, I said. This isn't a case where you should have known better and should be chided into doing better next time. There's no way you could have known. Even I, with all of my learning, have never heard of a beast the likes of which you have described. The pair looked at me with gratitude in their eyes. Okay, then we'll put a barrier up at the broken wall as soon as possible. We'll make it the strongest runic barrier we can make, damn the expense. While the barrier is up, we'll send a missive to the kingdom to make them aware of our troubles and request elite adventurers to vanquish the beast. There's bound to be enough loot to make it worth their while, Gluhern said. Does this satisfy your concerns, Alern and Rirnu? No, Alern replied, falling to his knees. I am shamed, Chief. I meant to be the greatest warrior in this village, yet I fled in terror, leaving my closest friend to die. This turn of events wasn't unexpected. Alern was known for being honorable and wore heavy plate mail, despite wielding a great sword for the sole purpose of being a bigger target. He prided himself on taking all of the hits for a party, keeping them safe while they fought. Nash and I locked eyes. He had clenched his teeth again. Then the chief spoke. You are not shamed. You have worked harder than most to be as strong as you are, so it is unlikely that you could have worked any harder or been any stronger by the time your party faced this monstrosity. If the roles had been reversed, and Kirisaka had ran while you fought, you would have died as quickly as Pakin. But Chief, no. Listen to me, Alern. It was a bad matchup. Your strength is great against strength, but that creature surpassed your strength and was many times faster than you. It would have cleaved through your armor in mere moments, and then been on Kirisaka and Rirnu. Kirisaka would have died either way, and the village would be left with one fewer adventurer, Gluhern said, leaning back in his seat. Even if you are to be shamed, I cannot think of a worse punishment than having to continue on as an adventurer without your closest comrade. Mourn Kirisaka, comfort his family, heal your mental wounds, and get back to work. Do you hear this judgment? Yes, Chief, the mountainous orc said. Good. You both have 3 days off, and then you'll report this situation directly to High Chief Ulermak. Alern, Rirnu, you two are dismissed. Nash, Yulk, please remain. The 2 over-10s left the chief's chambers, leaving Nash, Nick, and myself standing before Chief Gluhern. I always found it awkward when I had to witness Gluhern actually be a chief. I much prefer being blissfully ignorant to his wisdom and continuing on as if he were a bumbling fool. No matter, I'm sure his bumbling ways would make themselves evident again soon enough. Now, what to do about you, Nick? Gluhern asked. We should find a way to grant him citizenship of the village, or whatever the equivalent of citizenship is for a village, I said, tapping my chin at the quandary. I know he's shown that he can be useful, but he's not an orc. This is an orc village, not a mixed village. It's part of our mandate. So why? Well, the fact that we found him in the dungeon could pose problems in the future if we don't. Dungeons are first come, first served, but not necessarily first registered, first served. He's been in the dungeon presumably since before we settled here, since none of us saw him enter, I said, placing my hand on Nick's shoulder to keep him from trying to correct me. If we send him on his merry way, everyone that he runs into will have questions about his origins. Some of those answers may get back to the Kuraguard, and that could result in an investigation, which would result in our claim being temporarily revoked, or even permanently revoked if it finds in favor of the human. I see, Gluhern said, narrowing his eyes as if to try to see through my bullshit. If he were part of the village, then our claim couldn't be revoked. His claim on the dungeon would merge with ours. Would that be satisfactory to you, human? Gluhern asked. Yes, Nick said as I squeezed his shoulder pointedly. Okay, now the problem is, how do we go about doing this? I'm certain His Majesty won't approve of us just adding him to our roster. Adoption. High Chief Ulermak can't contest an adoption, Nash said. I'm sure Mom wouldn't mind. What do you think, Yulk? I was shocked at the suggestion. It was surprising enough that Nash was suggesting that the human be our brother, but the actual cleverness behind the scheme was even more surprising. He was correct. The High Chief can't contest an adoption. He was also correct that Mother would likely go for the scheme. She had a big heart and loved non-orc company. I couldn't help but grin at how conniving my brother was being. I'm sure she wouldn't mind at all. That's a great idea, actually, I replied. That would also settle the matter of where to keep him. We just clean out a room for him. I've been meaning to move my laboratory to the alchemists anyway. Good. Then it's settled. We'll talk to Mom and get the human moved in, Nash replied while turning to Nick. Then he asked in a dangerous tone, Unless the human has an objection? No, I don't. Thank you, Nick said. All right, sounds good. Nick will have to remain in the hospital until Yilda makes the adoption official, though, which means you're still on guard duty, Gluhern said with a chuckle. Ah, if I could have a moment, Chief? I asked. Sure, Nick, Nash, you're dismissed. My brother looked at me with curiosity before deciding that he'd rather not know why I wanted to spend more time with the Chief. Nick and Nash turned and left, leaving Gluhern and I alone. I'd been wanting to have this conversation for quite some time, and I had been thinking about the best way to broach the subject. Gluhern opened his mouth to speak, but I interrupted him. I'd like to teach the human how to use magic. We should wake him up, Yulk said, his voice doing just that. Don't get impatient. We've got a lot to do today. He'll need his rest, Nash replied. Silently giving my wholehearted agreement to Nash, I pretended to still be asleep. We do have a lot to do today, and I can't wait to get started, Yulk exclaimed, loudly. It won't be as fun as you're imagining, and it will be even less fun if he's half asleep all day, Nash stated. The only thing I could think of that we had to do today was move me from this hospital to Nash and Yulk's mom's place. Since I didn't have any stuff, that shouldn't take all day, unless there were ceremonies or something. I don't want to take part in a ceremony, though. Fun or not, it's still exciting to see what training will bring out in him. Is he strong? Is he weak? Only one way to find out, and we can't do that while he's asleep, Yulk nearly shouted. A feeling of dread spread through my core. Training. I doubt they had virtual reality, which would mean actual fighting. And since Yulk doesn't appear to be the physical fitness guru of the village, that will mean fighting against Nash. A fight against a 6'10" inches orc that has muscles that professional bodybuilders would kill for? No thanks. I'll pretend to be asleep all damn day. Quiet down. Why are you so excited about his training? The only thing you care about is whether he can do magic or not, Nash said. Magic? The abilities of those with magical talent are frequently opposed to the abilities of those with physical talent. So if he's bad at physical skills, then he might be amazing at magical skills. Or if he's good at physical skills, he might be terrible at magic. That would be disappointing, but either way it will answer questions that I have, Yulk said, toning his voice down a couple of notches. Although there's a chance that he's good at both. We've never seen anything like him, so it doesn't make sense to apply our own limitations to him offhand. So which would you rather have him do first? Magic or muscle? Nash asked. Magic, I said, sitting up. Both orcs turned to look at me. Nash raised an eyebrow at me as Yulk began to smile ear to ear. The mental image of a grinning demon was difficult to shake, especially with the sharp teeth. Nash stood up and looked down at me. Fine, we'll do magic before testing your physical abilities. Before we do any of that, though, we're going to introduce you to our mom. She's going to decide whether or not you get to stay with us, and if she decides you can stay, you're going to become our brother, he said. Don't be expecting any fanfare, though. Best you'll get is a big dinner tonight. Indeed. Elves and dwarves may throw lavish celebrations, but orcs rarely do, Yulk added. Do humans celebrate often? It depends on the humans, I answered. Some celebrate every chance they get. Others never celebrate anything. There's a lot of in-between, too. Nash looked impatient. Let's go. Mom's already up, so we might as well get this out of the way. I quickly got dressed and followed the two orcs out of the hospital and down the street. The more we walked, the more I noticed the buildings in the village. There were a lot more than I thought there'd be. These buildings looked as if they were made from different architects, and those architects were trying to outdo each other. Some were made of wood, some were made of a type of gray brick, and others were made of a mixture of materials. Some buildings were obviously houses or shops, but others were anyone's guess. There was also plenty of plant life, grasses, trees, bushes, and everything else you would normally see in a wooded area. On the horizon were mountains, looking like jagged black teeth that had just bit a pouch of white paint. They reminded me of the Rocky Mountains, but with less snow on top. It was comforting, in a way. I also noticed that we were getting a lot of stares. I felt a little self-conscious, but completely understood their curiosity. I tried imagining the reactions that humans would have to an orc being escorted down a busy street. Actually, come to think of it, most people would probably just assume it was a really good cosplay. I chuckled to myself as I realized that little kids would likely have the most appropriate reactions to that situation. As we walked, Nash and Yulk nodded and waved to people that we passed. The village seemed too large for everyone to know each other, so these two seemed to have a lot of friends. I had some friends back in my world, but not close enough for me to be broken up by their absence. More like the hanging out if it's convenient and occasionally vent with kinda pals. Even so, Cassandra's illness had closed me off in a big way. I didn't have time for anyone but her because our time together was so limited. She hated that, but understood that it was my choice and the only way that I could cope. I had been hoping for some miracle to happen, and now I'm just hoping to get to see her one more time. I was pulled from this line of thought by Nash pointing to a big wooden house surrounded by an equally wooden fence. That's ours, he said. We approached the gate, and two large creatures that looked like a lot like dogs came bounding out the front door, yelling as they came. They were about twice the size of a husky and similarly shaped, but completely without fur. Their skin was black with green stripes. I was startled by their size and appearance, as well as the fact that they weren't barking so much as shouting "hey" over and over. Yulk noticed my expression. Those are puppers, Dima and Nucho specifically. Dima is carnivorous, Nucho is herbivorous. You'll be able to tell by the teeth, he explained as Nash wrangled them back into the house. I followed Yulk closely, suddenly feeling out of place. I also found it odd that I hadn't felt this out of place before. I guess it must be how lived in this house feels compared to everywhere else I had been. Makes me feel like I'm intruding. It looked about as clean as a normal house, and smelled like unfamiliar cooking and cleaning, like going to a new friend's home. The furniture in the house was similar to that of the hospital, like modern-day medieval knockoffs. Tables with metallic inlays, wooden chairs with padding on the seats and backs, and even doors with metal handles. Nash was struggling to hold onto the puppers as Yulk led me deeper into the house until we entered the kitchen. At the table sat an orc woman who gave me a warm smile when she saw me. I had expected her hair to be black like Nash's, but it was blonde with some gray strands here and there. She had a bit of wizening around the eyes, but other than that it was hard to tell that she was any older than the two orcs that escorted me here. Her green skin was also a few shades lighter than her son's. Come to think of it, I hadn't seen any male orcs with light skin or female orcs with dark skin. Mom, this is Nick Smith. He's a human. Nick, this is Yilda, mother of Nash, mother of Yulk, and many other titles. Yolk said with pride. I only go by my two most important titles, Yilda said, standing from the table. Nice to meet you, I replied as she walked up to me. She narrowed her eyes to study me closely and placed a hand upon my shoulder. She turned me so that she could look at me in profile, and I was taken aback by how strong she was. Yilda was only an inch or two taller than me and didn't look particularly muscular, but I got the distinct feeling that even if I had tried not to be turned, my resistance would have been futile. After a few seconds of examination and mumbling, she turned back to Nash and Yolk. He's cute. I'll take him into my care, she said. Say hello to your new brother, boys. We already have, Mom, Nash said, still struggling with the dog-like creatures. Hello, Nick, Yolk exclaimed with glee. Nash? Yilda said, staring pointedly at the orc in question. All right. Hello, Nick. Welcome to the family, Nash sighed. Thank you. I appreciate your hospitality, I replied, nearly choking up. This was a confusingly emotional moment for me. If I were to look at it from afar, I would probably find it funny. In the moment, though, I felt warm and fuzzy feelings. I'd never had siblings before, and the kindness that I was being shown was nearly overwhelming. This orc, this woman, had just given me a once-over and decided to keep me fed and housed. It's not the kind of kindness that you see every day. With the warm and fuzzy feelings came a sense of profound sadness. I miss my parents, and I miss Cass. I didn't have the perfect life in my world, to be sure, but the people in it made it worth living. Despite Nash's aggression and Yolk's mad scientist vibes, they seem like good people. I have to find a way back to Cass, but by doing so I'll be abandoning them. And now they are my brothers. Deep breath in, clench your jaw. Men don't cry. That's the law. A little rhyme that my father taught me when I was younger to help teach me to calm down in emotional moments. I used to tell him that there isn't a law against men crying, and he would smile back and say that not all laws are written. I didn't really know what that meant until high school. All right, that's settled then. Time for training, Yolk said, nearly bouncing again. Aren't you going to eat? Yilda asked indignantly. There's no time for such things, Mother. We must discover what Nick is capable of. Scientific discovery awaits, Yolk exclaimed. Yolk, training doesn't work as well on an empty stomach, Nash said. We'll eat after. Don't want food sloshing around our stomachs ruining things. Let's go, Nick. Nash and Yilda looked at me as Yolk marched past me, holding his staff in the air like he was leading a marching band. I shrugged, not knowing what else to do. I'm not really hungry right now, but maybe training could change that, I said cautiously. All right, I'll hang back and get your room ready. Don't let Yolk push you too hard. One of the things he wants to know is your limits, so be sure to let him know once you've reached them, Nash said, as he wrangled the puppers into another room. Have fun, dear. We'll get to know each other a bit better over dinner, Yilda said with a smile. Thanks, I replied, turning to follow Yolk. Come on, Nick, Yolk shouted from the door. I hurried after him. We walked through town again, his high spirits unfaltering. I was excited to learn more about magic and whether or not I could do it. I also felt nervous, both because of Yolk's expectations and the fact that magic was likely my way home. If I suck at it? No. Negativity won't help. I can do this, whatever this is. We passed many staring eyes until we finally came to what looked like an old-fashioned archery training pit. Bricks surrounded a dirt ring with targets placed intermittently within. Yolk sat on a nearby bench and gestured in front of him. I sat cross-legged in the dirt facing him. All right, let's begin your magic training, he said with a smile. Do you have any questions to start off with? I don't know enough to have any, I explained. Fair enough. Magic is easier done than said. It stems from forces that we don't quite understand, but seems to be contained within everything. Those who are attuned to magic often feel as if they should be able to do things that they can't, like move objects without their hands. Have you ever felt like that? He asked. Yes, when I was a kid, I replied. Excellent, Yolk exclaimed with a grin. Now, the reason that people get this feeling is because they are partially attuned to the magic that surrounds us, or they're fully attuned and just aren't attuned to their own magic energy. To to use a spell, you have to mix the surrounding magic with your own magic and properly channel it through the natural pathways in your own body. Pathways? I asked. Yes. There are many pathways in the body. Your blood vessels, nerves, and digestive system, for example. Your magic pathways are similar but separate. Your magical energy is stored somewhere in your body and can be channeled elsewhere in your body through these pathways. If you concentrate on yourself, you should be able to feel it. Mine is in my brain, he said while pointing to his skull. Okay, I'll try, I replied. I closed my eyes and began to concentrate on my body. I felt my skin tingling from exposure to the sun and whatever else was in the air. I felt my ribs spreading and closing with every breath. I felt my heart beating and the blood being pushed through my veins and arteries. I felt the wind blow through my hair and my clothes resting on my body. Then I felt it, a somewhat electrical energy, directly in the center of my upper torso. I pointed at it. It's here. I knew it, Yulk said, pumping his fist in celebration. Okay. For the next part, you're going to have to learn channeling. Your own magic won't be able to do much on its own, so you'll need to intake magic from your surroundings and mix it in your core to fire off a spell. How do I do that? I asked. The easiest way is through breathing. The air has magic in it, and you just need to think about pulling the magic out and storing it in your core. It will mix with your own magic, and you can channel that into a spell, he explained. But you get more by drawing magic in through your channels. I can't feel my channels, though. Exactly, and you won't be able to until you use them. That's why we start out new mages with breath charging before anything else. Go on, try it out. It should take about 20 or so deep breaths to get you nice and charged up. I closed my eyes again and began to do as instructed. I breathed in through my mouth and out through my nose. The electric feeling got slightly more intense, and I could feel the two different magics in my chest. I imagined them combining, and a third kind of magic appeared. It felt amazing, like I had all the energy in the world. A few breaths later, and I somehow knew that I was fully charged up. Okay, I'm ready, I said. What? That was only 10 breaths, are you sure? Yulk asked. No, well, yes, my core feels full, I replied. Is that bad? The orc studied me with narrowed eyes and scratched his chin for a moment. I don't know, he finally replied. We'll see. Okay, let's go to the targets. We got up and approached the range. From a distance, I had thought they were made of straw, but they were actually statues made of stone. Judging by all the pits and charring, they had definitely seen plenty of use. Yulk picked up 2 stones and walked over to one of the targets. He placed the stones on the target's shoulders and walked back over to me. All right, I want you to try an easy spell. It's called Wind Spear, and its name is a very apt description of what you will need to imagine to create the spell. I'll demonstrate, he said, raising his hand. Rapes de new tsak. I flinched as I felt wind erupt from Yulk's hand, but I also felt the magic and was transfixed. The stone on the statue's left shoulder shattered into pieces. The orc grinned and turned to me, the sun gleaming off his bald head. Like that, he said. You should be able to disturb the stone on the right once you figure out the spell. Wait, do I have to do the incantation? I asked. No, the incantation happens naturally. You can increase the power of a spell by mindfully saying the incantation, but that takes quite a bit of practice, he said with a smile. Now give it a try. Use both hands, though, for safety since you don't know your channels yet. Will I need a staff like the one you have? Yulk laughed. No, you won't need an arcane focus until you're much further along. Even further along than I am. The only reason I have one is because when I was younger, I went on a dungeon raid with Nash and ended up breaking my back. Rearnu did his best to heal me, but he was only level 6 at the time, so I ended up with difficulty walking. So my staff is both an arcane focus and a walking stick, but I use it for walking. Enough about that. Go ahead and try to cast the spell, Nick. Okay, I'll try. I raised my hands and aimed them at the stone. I thought about how wind works, gas molecules bumping into other gas molecules, pushing them along. The pushing is caused by gases getting hotter and colder, which causes them to get lighter or heavier than the other molecules around them. The harder they push, the faster the wind goes. I imagined this happening, but being channeled into a spear that rushed toward the stone. Then I felt a sort of click. "Ripes di Newtsak," my voice said. I felt the magic in my chest flow through my arms and through all 10 of my fingers. The intensity of the movement almost hurt, but felt good at the same time. The tingling sensation pushed itself out of my fingers, manifesting my will. The air pressure around my hands erupted with a blast of wind that pushed me back a step. Wind spear unlocked. "What?" I asked, looking at Yulk. I didn't say anything," Yulk said, staring at the target with his mouth agape. I looked at the target, and my mouth dropped open as well. There was dust settling around the statue, but I could see that it was missing its head and shoulder. The stone was nowhere to be seen, and the arm had fallen onto the ground. Behind the target, there was a noticeable dent in the bricks. What the hell? Wind did this? I did this? We stood shocked for a few moments, but then Yulk's opened mouth turned back into a grin as he turned to me. I met his eyes, and he placed his hand on my shoulder, his sharp teeth glistening in the sunlight. He definitely reminded me of a smiling demon. "I fucking knew it," he said. "We're gonna have quite a time together, Nick."